What is evidence? What counts as evidence? What doesn't count as evidence? What are the problems we need to be aware of as we start to identify and collect evidence as a part of a forensic investigation? If we better understand the different types of evidence that we are likely to come in contact with or we are likely to encounter during different kinds of investigations, we can predict ahead of time where are the possible sources of error, where are the places where we are most likely to get things wrong. For instance, misinterpretations, misunderstandings, manipulations, things like that, contamination, things like that, that could help us prevent errors or problems in our understanding of the evidence ahead of time. But also, can our understanding of the different kinds of evidence that we are likely to encounter, we are likely to find, can that help us better predict what we need to do to take care of the scene of the investigation, to carefully understand what's going on, and also to kind of check our own preconceived notions? The more we understand about the evidence, the more prepared we are to deal with where the possible errors might show up. So that's why I think we need to take some time and really think through evidence, the different vocabulary we can use, the different types, the different forms it might take, and the different situations where that evidence will show up. Please, at any point during today's conversation, if you have a question, just unmute and speak up, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to kind of keep up with everything going on in different places. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I want to bring up, I mentioned this to you guys when I introduced the slides to you, that the very first thing we wanted to remind ourselves of was Locard's principle of exchange, or the exchange principle from Edmund Locard. We have already seen this earlier in the semester. A couple of weeks ago, you guys watched a video from a university in Singapore where they introduced kind of the history and development of forensic science, as well as some of the really old 100 to 200-year-old influences on the original development of this field that today we call forensic science. And one of those most important influences was a guy named Edmund Locard. He is actually kind of understood as the modern creator of the field of forensic science because of this really famous quote from him that is on the screen right now. Wherever he steps, he being the criminal, or the person who we are tracking with the evidence, wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. The idea that every single interaction, no matter intentional or unintentional, fast or slow, whatever the kinds of interactions that we have either in our daily lives or when we're getting involved with something sketchy like a crime or something undercover and mysterious, all of those interactions will leave some sort of trace evidence behind. Now, I think Edmund Locard had in mind something physical. In fact, this quote mentions fingerprints, footprints, hair, fibers, glass, tools, markings, things like that. But I also have encouraged us as a class to think more broadly about this idea and the implications of the evidence we leave behind. We live in a modern world shaped by technology. We constantly leave digital traces behind. We constantly leave emotional and relational impressions on the people that we connect with, the people we talk with, the people we interact with on a daily basis. I know that right now we're kind of siloed off in our separate homes, but the reality is that every interaction we have, digital, in person, they always leave some kind of evidence behind. Sometimes that's the words we speak or the impressions or the emotions we feel, and other times that is the physical traces of our existence that are left behind. You guys have actually already kind of experimented with this with the time capsule assignment that you did earlier this semester, right? You looked at your own life and thought, okay, what is the evidence that my personal life leaves behind every day? What are the things that people know about me? What are the things that represent not just who I am and how I spend my time, but what's important to me and the other people that are connected to me? All of that comes back to Locard's principle of exchange, this idea that every interaction leaves a trace behind. And that is where the foundation of forensic evidence comes from. So keep that in the back of your mind the whole time today. We're talking about types of evidence, categories of evidence, the different ways we deal with evidence, and the different kinds of situations where we might find evidence during our investigations. All right, so let's start with the definition of what is evidence and why does it even matter. In science, we often talk about data, right? We talk about the basic information that we get from experiments or research, and that's what evidence is, just to a forensic investigation. It's evident, I mean, it's data, it's information that comes from, if it's a crime, the crime scene, or if it's some other mysterious situation, whatever environment you are investigating and the people involved, it's the information that comes from that environment. And if we want to come up with like a specific definition that is reliable, we can refer to this definition from Jay Siegel, who is a very commonly known writer in the field of forensic science. He's very academic, but his definition here is that evidence is anything that helps prove or disprove. Science is actually more often about disproving things than about proving things. Whoa, crazy things about the way science really works. Whoa. Anything that helps us prove or disprove something about the situation or the scenario being investigated. It is often something that is like a physical object, or it could be circumstances, details about a situation, testimony, things that people actually say or remember or observed, ideas, even assumptions and opinions. But when we get to the idea of assumptions and opinions, we should remember, oh, wait a minute, that's going to be subjective, right? That's going to depend on the preconceived notions, the views and perspectives of the person who's speaking them, right? So anytime humans get involved, we have bias. So it's important for us to know that most pieces of evidence, even if it is a physical object, has the possibility of being impacted by the imperfection of human bias and human perspective. And so that means we have to be aware of that when we start the process of analyzing, interpreting, and applying that evidence to the situation we are investigating. So as we continue to kind of define what evidence is, and it's important for us to think about evidence as a tool, it's a resource. And what we are trying to do is find the evidence we need to prove and support the best possible explanation of what happened in the mysterious situation or the crime scene that we are trying to investigate and explain. An important thing to think back to is the idea of deductive versus inductive thinking. Remember, in deductive thinking, we start with the big picture, and then we look for the evidence that supports that. And then inductive thinking, we start with the pieces of evidence that we have, or the small pieces of information that we have available to us, and we work backwards to try to figure out, okay, what does that mean happened? We talked about the fact that even though Sherlock Holmes calls himself a deductive expert, he's actually most often using inductive thinking because he starts with the teeny tiny details of the situation and uses that to make sense out of what's going on. In an investigation, evidence is your starting point. So evidence is either those little tiny details that we're starting with, and we are working backwards to figure out what does that mean happened here, or we have some preconceived notions based on other information given to us, either from witnesses or what was actually seen by the investigators, and then we try to find the evidence that shows and supports that explanation of what happened there. So the reality here, though, is that we're not going to be able to use evidence to prove anything because we weren't actually there to see it, right? And proof is all about actual fact. Well, instead, what we're trying to do is just get closer and closer and closer to the best possible explanation of what happened in that weird situation that we are investigating. So it's really important that what we do with evidence is that we gather it, we present it, we connect all those pieces together so that we can try to convince someone else that our explanation is the closest thing to true as possible. And that's where we get this idea of the burden of proof that you might have heard of in legal investigations or legal cases, innocent until proven guilty. The idea is that evidence is what we rely on to try to reach that burden of proof, to try to show others that our explanation of what happened in that crime or mysterious or unknown situation is the best possible explanation, is the most likely explanation to be true. All right. Now, when we start talking about all that different evidence, now that we've defined it, now that we've talked about why it's important and how we use it, it's really important for us to understand that there's specific categories that evidence can fit into. And depending on which category it fits into, it's going to play a certain role in our investigation. We're going to have to handle it certain ways, and we're going to have to look out for certain possible problems with that evidence. So here, another quote from Jay Siegel: evidence can be classified in a number of ways, and a given piece of evidence can probably fall into more than one category. So we're going to talk about a lot of terms today. And the reality is they are not mutually exclusive, meaning that just because a piece of evidence fits into one category does not mean it doesn't also fit into others. And often certain categories tend to be lined up with one another. The type or category piece of evidence fits into determines how it might be recognized, meaning when we see it or we recognize it as a piece of valuable evidence when we enter the scene of whatever situation occurred. The way it is collected and preserved, meaning the way we actually take it out of that scene and then try to take care of it and preserve it so that it won't be contaminated or it won't decompose or break apart or become damaged. The way it is documented. Remember way back when we talked about what are the actual actions that forensic scientists do, or the people who do forensic science jobs. We talked about the thing that takes up most of their time is documentation, because that's the most important part of a legal process, is making sure that you've got reliable, complete documentation that shows all the different steps of the process. And then also how we're going to analyze, interpret, and understand that evidence, but also the way that it can possibly be explained to others. All of that is impacted by the category or the type of evidence that we're working with. All right, let's talk about some broad categories of evidence. Okay, so here's where we start getting into the really important vocabulary that it's important for you to know and be able to use for our forensic science class. So let's start with the ideas of direct and indirect evidence. So direct evidence is evidence that gives us an exact fact without needing to actually be interpreted or inferred. So this is where we have a piece of evidence that is not really questionable. So it doesn't require us to do anything else to it. It automatically gives us the information. So an example of that, you can look at the bottom here, at the bottom of the slide here. A surveillance camera records a person walking up to a bank teller and using a weapon to threaten them and steal the money. The video footage, this is the important part, is clear enough so that the person's face, physical characteristics, and actions can be easily seen. The assailant, the suspect, is identified and arrested and charged for robbery. Because that piece of evidence was able to directly connect that person, their identity, to that place, to that time, to that act that was a crime, that was a problem, or that was illegal, then that shows that this is direct evidence. So it's not something that we would then need to figure out if it really was that person. That is recognizable evidence, and so we call it direct evidence. Indirect evidence, however, is what most forensic science is based on, right? The whole need for scientific investigation and analysis of evidence is when it's not direct. So that's why we have this whole other category called indirect evidence. So this is where you're going to need to take one more step after the piece of evidence is recognized and collected or preserved and documented. You're going to need to take another step where we're going to have to do some analysis, some interpretation, or some inference work to make sense out of it. So if you look at the example continues here at the bottom. So after their arrest, so after the person who was arrested in this situation over here, after their arrest, a gun is found at the suspect's home that matches the video footage from the bank robbery. A fingerprint is taken from the gun and matched to the suspect, and also compared to fingerprints found at the crime scene. The fingerprint analysis is used to further show the connection between the suspect, the gun, and the crime scene. So even though we had the direct evidence, there was other evidence available. That evidence just required some work, some analysis, some interpretation. And a lot of times that's going to happen in a scientific laboratory of some sort. So indirect evidence is where we actually need to go and take another step. We need to do some thinking to actually connect that evidence back to the suspect or to the situation. For example, fingerprint markings or the labeling or serial number on a gun. Those things, we need to take those numbers and we need to take that evidence, the fingerprints, the markings, all that stuff, and we need to do a little bit of analysis, some work, before we can directly connect it back to the person involved. So indirect evidence is what most forensic evidence actually looks like. Now, another word for this, and this is something you've probably heard in your legal procedural drama. So, if you're a fan of Law and Order or any show that shows legal cases, you've probably heard them talk about this issue of circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial is just another word for indirect evidence. Okay, so those two words are interchangeable; they mean the same thing. And circumstantial is just simply another vocabulary word that is commonly used that you might hear outside of our class that I want you to be aware of. So circumstantial, indirect evidence, they mean the same thing. And what that tells us is we've got two broad, big categories that all evidence will fit inside of. Either direct, because we don't need to do any analysis. It already shows us a direct connection between the situation, the people involved, and our investigation. Or we have circumstantial or indirect evidence where we need to actually connect it. A lot of times in those legal shows, they try to make it seem like circumstantial evidence is number one, rare, and number two, not allowed in court. The reality is the majority of evidence that is presented in legal trials or legal investigations is circumstantial because we weren't there to see it to begin with. And most not dumb criminals or people who do something sketchy are smart enough to make sure that they don't leave any direct evidence behind. And so that's why the majority of evidence is indirect. The majority of evidence is actually circumstantial. So careful with the way that word is represented on TV or in the movies or in books and stuff. Yeah, that evidence is circumstantial. That means it's not reliable. Well, actually, most evidence is circumstantial. We just need to go through a reliable process to connect it back to the people involved, the situation in our investigation. All right. The one other thing to be aware of with indirect evidence is this is where problems in forensic science are really rooted. The idea here is that if we have to do some sort of interpretation, some sort of analysis, some sort of extra work, and the evidence itself is not directly connected to the people, the place, the time, and the investigation that is underway, then that means there's possible room for error. There's possible room for perspective and bias and prejudice and manipulation to show up. I'm not saying that happens all the time. I'm not even saying that it happens a lot, but it happens enough that we need to be very aware of the reality of this possibility in our work. And we need to look for ways to try to prevent it and look for what the possible motivations would be for these things to kind of creep their way into our forensic investigations. And this is really where the idea of reasonable doubt comes from in legal trials. So the idea of being beyond a reasonable doubt, the prosecution, the people who are accusing somebody of a crime have the responsibility of they have the burden of proof to show that the person they are accusing, the suspect, the accused, is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that means they often need to show that the evaluation, the interpretation, the analysis of any circumstantial and indirect evidence is so reliable that it's not really refutable, that they need to show that there was an error or bias or misinterpretation and prejudice and manipulation in there. They need to show that, no, this is a reliable scientific representation or understanding and interpretation of what that evidence has to tell us about the original situation. Okay. I want to pause there. That was like a huge chunk of information. That's probably one of the most important things we'll talk about today. Does anybody need to unmute and ask a question or put a question into the chat? So I think that's an awesome question, and what it shows me is that you're following the thinking I was hoping for right away. So I'm very happy to hear that. The question, just to repeat it for the recording, the question was: is there any gray area between direct and indirect or circumstantial evidence? Is there anywhere where that kind of gets blurred? And the answer is yeah, absolutely yes. The whole field of forensic science is blurry. And that's kind of one of the things that we talked about right away, right? The very first thing we did when we defined forensic science is we defined it as the use of evidence to better understand some sort of mysterious or unknown situation. And yet that relies on people who are all sorts of problematic. So you're exactly right to say, so there's probably going to be some situations where there is a blurriness between things being direct and things being indirect. Yes, they are. There absolutely is. I'm struggling to come up with some specific examples. Maybe we'll find more examples as we go through the rest of these slides. But I also want to say what you followed up in your question was correct, that, well, so if there's any blurriness, if there's any question to whether or not it's direct, does that just automatically put it in the circumstantial or the indirect category? And I think the answer to that is yes. There is even some direct evidence or some things that we might consider to be direct evidence that actually has some question or some circumstantialness about it. And so we're just going to push it over into the indirect category, and we're going to do some reliable analysis so that we can show that it is true. For example, look at the scenario we've got right here. If we go back, we had direct evidence here in this scenario of the bank robbery, right? We had direct evidence. Well, why do we need to go and get more evidence? Because we want to make sure we've got a case that is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's often where we kind of have to blur the lines between them, because we got to go even further. Does that answer the question that you were asking? I really appreciate that question. That was great. Great. Yeah. There were two other comments in the chat while we were talking about that, and I think these are suggestions of where that blurriness between direct and indirect evidence might come from. And one person said, I'm sorry, I'm not using your names on purpose because of the recording. So it's not that I don't want to recognize you and give you credit for what you're saying. I'm just trying to protect privacy and stuff. All right, so one person said, like, blurry surveillance footage. I think that would be a really great example, or maybe an audio recording that was really hard to understand. The idea is that should be direct evidence, but because it is difficult to identify the people in the recording, it might blur into the side of indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence, and kind of introduces some possible deniability, right? So I think that's a great example. Another person said, could an example be planted physical evidence? I'd love to hear you say more about that, but I think most physical evidence is probably going to be indirect to begin with. So the fact that it was planted or the fact that it was manipulated doesn't necessarily put it into one category or the other. But the fact that that is something that has happened historically, and could possibly happen if the people involved in the investigation aren't abiding by their ethics standards or the expectations of their job, their position. If they're violating that, then that definitely leaves room for these issues we're talking about right here, which is the whole issue with the majority of evidence that we would call forensic evidence. Anybody want to add anything to that? Okay, sure. Go ahead. Another question. I think the answer is yes. So to repeat your question, at what point does an investigation go from just, like a domestic disturbance where somebody called 911 or some officer of the law recognized that something might be wrong, and how does that turn into like a full-fledged investigation where you've got more training involved, so detectives or forensic investigators, analysis, things like that? Where's that line? How do we know when we've gone from just an everyday situation into a real investigation? And to be honest, I'm not sure I can answer that, because I'm not a professional police officer, right? I'm not a person who does that for a living. But that would be a really good question for us to ask a professional police officer. So if any of you have a connection to somebody at home or in your family or a family friend, like, that would be a really cool question to ask them. Where, at what point do things kind of switch over and somebody else takes over, because now this is a more complicated situation that requires a full investigation? Let me try to respond to your question by telling a personal story. So about a year and a half ago, my mother, I love her to death. I am my mother. It's the most embarrassing thing about me, is I am like all the worst things about her. And one day you will all be your parents and you will hate every bit of it. But the reality for my mom is she doesn't pay a lot of attention sometimes. And one night she went to bed. She lives by herself. She went to bed and she left her garage door open and her car unlocked with the keys inside. You already know where, you can already see where this is going. That just happened to be the night that there was actually this like county-wide chase happening. There was this group of like 4 or 5 guys that had committed like a burglary or like a robbery of like a convenience store in like Holly Springs or something, and then they stole a car and they kind of drove it and kind of had like this little mini version of a police chase all across Raleigh, and they finally got kind of lost the police when they got into Wake Forest, and they dropped off the car and ran through the woods into the neighborhood that my mom lives in, and they were just going door by door in cars looking for something that was unlocked, and sure enough, there's my mom's car just sitting there waiting. So my mom's car was stolen out of her driveway because of it just so happened that she was irresponsible and left it open and unlocked on the night where something sketchy was happening, right? Okay, well, right away, so the next morning, my mom realizes what's happened and she calls the police. Okay, so a police officer shows up. He immediately starts taking notes, but he doesn't touch anything. There was actually stuff that had been thrown out of her car, so that would be like physical evidence on the street that she lived in, so it was clear that like they were getting rid of stuff out of the car as they were driving off. And he doesn't go mess with any of that stuff. He waits and he calls somebody else, and that's when 2 Wake Forest Police Department detectives showed up, and their job was to go look at the evidence and stuff. So there's something in that process where where I think as soon as the police officer realizes that there is some question to be solved, as in this is connected to other events, or we need to do some more investigative work with the specific evidence that's left behind to try to connect it to a person that we can't automatically identify, I think that's what triggers the next level. So I think a police officer, like an everyday kind of situation, would be where the solution is obvious, where there is not a clear crime that has been committed, and or if the people are all immediately available and you can immediately kind of figure out what happened. I think when you have to go to the next level of like investigators and detectives and things like that is when the person's not around anymore, and we need to look for some sort of evidence to show who it was and how they were involved. Does that answer your question? Did I ramble too much, or did that story kind of give us maybe a little bit of an example? Maybe. Okay. Well, I'm glad you didn't forget your question, and I am happy if it is not the right time to ask that question, I will ask you to hold on to it and we'll come back to it later. But that was just fine to ask at that point. All right, let's move ahead. So now let's talk about the next category of evidence. Okay, so think of the category is not the right word, tier of evidence, maybe, or layer of evidence. So we already talked about direct and indirect evidence. Now we're going to talk about another way of categorizing evidence that overlaps with, it's not instead of or inside of, it's kind of on top of direct and indirect or in circumstantial evidence. So now we've got real, demonstrative, and testimonial evidence. These are kind of the broadest categories other than direct or indirect that we'll deal with today. So real evidence is what we often think of as physical evidence. In fact, we've already been using that term a little bit, right? Material evidence, the stuff that you can actually find and pick up. You can photograph it. You can put it into a baggie or into a container and take it away from the crime scene. It's the physical objects, markings, and pieces that are left behind. That's what we call real evidence. Now, if you think a little bit into that vocabulary, you think that there's a little bit of priority here, right? Real evidence, because they're using that word real, might be preferred because of the fact that it is the kind of evidence that leads to often reliable scientific evaluation, which helps us deal with some of the problems with circumstantial evidence. So real evidence is evidence that is often also more often connected to more sophisticated scientific analysis techniques. And so a lot of times we kind of view real evidence as being more reliable because it's kind of matches these images that the public has of what's on TV and in the movies and in books and things like that, but also what looks very science-y, which can often show up as feeling more like proof in a court of law or in a trial. The next category is documentary evidence or documentary evidence. Sometimes it's called demonstrative evidence because instead of being physical, it is demonstrating something, it's showing something. And you can already interpret from the name that this is basically any kind of documentation but is not the direct actual evidence from the original scene of the investigation or the crime scene or the events that actually happened. This is documentation of what happened. So this would be a police report. This would be somebody's written. This would be somebody's written notes from being in the crime scene. This would be a sketch or photos or even three-dimensional renderings, timelines, things like that. Anything that the investigators create as documentation of what was going on at the crime scene or what was going on at the scene where they're investigating, that's documentary evidence. Now, the last category here, this is where we get to testimony, or the things that people say or observed or saw. And so this is where we get the possibility of bias and perspective kind of creeping its way into the evidence, which is one of the reasons why we often think of this last category as being probably the least reliable of the categories here. So testimonial evidence is evidence that's either written or spoken. So it's coming from a person that either observed or was involved or has direct knowledge or has some sort of I need to be careful with the word direct, don't I? Because we just use that term. So let me be careful with my vocabulary there. They have direct, they have knowledge connected to the events or the people involved, even if they weren't actually there to see it. They have some kind of information that might help investigators connect all the pieces together. So that's testimonial evidence. So inside of, or in addition to the categories of direct and indirect or circumstantial evidence, we also have real, demonstrative, or documentary evidence and testimonial evidence. Okay. Anybody need to ask a question about these three terms? You can also see some examples. Sorry, I should have said this before. There are some examples at the bottom of the screen here. So some pictures to try to give you some visual examples of what would be categorized in each of these. So here you see examples of real evidence. Here you see examples of what documentary or demonstrative evidence would look like. And over here we see testimonial evidence. A person identifying somebody in a lineup, somebody giving testimony in a court of law, things like that. All right, let's keep going. Now, inside of the category of physical evidence or real evidence, remember those two terms are interchangeable. Inside of that category, there's a whole bunch of specific types in there. And so it's really important for us to get that vocabulary so that you're ready to use it. So now we're going to go into the category of physical evidence, into the category of real evidence, and we're going to identify some more specific types that fit inside of that category. I want to read something here from the top. Since most physical evidence is indirect evidence, reliable analysis is an important part of connecting these different types back to the situation being investigated. And we have another Jay Siegel quote here. In the evaluation of physical evidence, the most important question is what or who is the source of the evidence? And so that leads us to, here's the next way to break up physical evidence into two categories. We've got known evidence and unknown evidence. So you see right here, we're explaining known evidence, and right here, we're explaining unknown evidence. So this is new vocabulary to add to the category of physical evidence. When it is known evidence, that means we know where the source came from right away, no question. Kind of like direct evidence, but this is inside of the category of physical evidence. We know where it came from. So for example, if you for a job or you're moving overseas or you want to be in the military or something like that, you need to have an FBI background check. One of the things that they're going to ask you to do is go to the local State Bureau of Investigation, it's in downtown Raleigh, and get your fingerprints taken by a fingerprinting expert. And they're going to use that in addition to checking your criminal background to make sure that your fingerprints are not connected to any unsolved or open cases. Because I go to the Bureau of Investigation and I show them my identification, I present myself physically there and I put my own fingers on there and they document my fingerprints. That is known evidence, right? We know that those fingerprints came from this guy and we know when they were taken, where they were taken, how they were taken, why they were taken. Okay, that's known evidence. However, if my fingerprints show up at a crime scene or at the scene of some sketchy situation that is being investigated, they have to go through the step of identifying that as mine, right? They don't know that it's mine from the beginning. They just found a fingerprint. There wasn't a person right there who, look, I touched the thing and now that's my fingerprint, or you saw me record it and we can connect it back to me. They have to do some analysis there. So that's what unknown evidence is. Anytime where we don't know exactly who left the evidence in that place or where it came from, then that's unknown evidence. So inside of physical evidence, the most important thing we can talk about, and the majority of the rest of this course is going to be based on physical evidence or real evidence. It's based on, do we know where it came from or not? Is it a known piece of evidence or is it an unknown piece of evidence? And that's where that's a really important distinction for us to make real quick. So let's look at the example down here at the bottom of the screen, right? So an example, several small drops of blood are found in a crime scene. After they are thoroughly documented, meaning we need to take photos of them, we need to write down where they were, we need to measure them, things like that. We'll practice all that later. That's in our CSI unit, crime scene investigation, coming up next. A sample of the blood is collected using sterile gauze, so a little absorbent cloth. We absorb it so that we can then send it for blood type and DNA analysis. The individuals who are suspected of possibly being involved in the crime are each asked to provide a blood sample for analysis and comparison to the blood found at the crime scene. So I want you right now, think to yourself, which of those samples of blood are the knowns versus the unknowns? Don't say it out loud yet. Think to yourself, what are the knowns and the unknowns in this situation? So we found some blood at a crime scene, we collect it, and we analyze it. During the investigation, we figure out, okay, there's like these 3 or 4 possible people that we've narrowed it down that we think were probably involved here. So now we want to ask each of them to give us a blood sample so that we can compare it to that other one. Which of those samples are known? Which of those samples are unknown? Anybody want to unmute and try that, or put it in the chat? Possible answer? Mm-hmm. So which blood is that? Got it. All right. So what we just said is that the several small drops of blood found at the crime scene, we don't know exactly who that came from because that person's not standing there bleeding over where the drops of blood. By the way, if anybody's bothered by me talking about blood, sorry, you should let me know those things, like so I don't freak you out or like make you pass out all of a sudden in class. Please let me know if you got an issue with this. That's important for me to know so I can take care of you in class. But yes, you're exactly right that those several drops of blood that were found at the crime scene, that's after the fact, right? So we don't know where they came from. We don't know who is the source of that blood. So that would be the unknown evidence. What is the known sample that we're going to compare that unknown evidence to? What are the known samples? All right. In the chat, we said the individuals who provide their blood for the test, right? The blood samples from the people. When we say the people, what we mean is the possible suspects, right? So we found this blood in the crime scene. So all the people who could possibly be involved, either because we're trying to exclude them or include them in our investigation, we're going to ask them to give us a sample. Those are known samples because we know where hey, you are a possible suspect, or hey, we want to make sure, we want to exclude you, so would you give us a sample of blood, please? We know where those samples came from. Now we're going to go and compare those to the unknown, which is what was found at the crime scene, and that is how most physical evidence is analyzed. One thing to be very aware of is an unknown sample is only as valuable as the known samples we can compare it to. An unknown sample doesn't give us much information because it's unknown. We don't know where it came from. But if we have a whole bunch of known samples that are just like in storage and available from other investigations or libraries of little fibers or fingerprints or things like that, that we can compare, the unknown samples from our crime scenes too that help us better figure out where the unknown ones came from, then they're valuable. But an unknown sample, an unknown piece of evidence is not valuable to us unless we have knowns to compare it to. So while we see those drops of blood there and they tell us that somebody got hurt and was bleeding in that crime scene, it doesn't tell us and it doesn't give us any information about who was involved there. We can't figure that out until we have a known sample to compare it to. Okay. Anybody need to ask a question about this idea of known versus unknown evidence? Really important idea here. Okay. So far today, we have talked about the general importance of evidence, the definition of evidence, and what role it plays in different investigations. We've also identified kind of three different layers of vocabulary that we need to be aware of. So direct versus indirect evidence. Indirect evidence is also called circumstantial evidence. Then we also talked about the idea of real or physical evidence, documentary or demonstrative evidence, and then testimonial evidence. So three different categories that we can also use to categorize different types of evidence. And then inside of physical evidence, we've now talked about known versus unknowns, or known evidence versus unknown evidence. Those three sets of vocabulary, they all overlap with one another. So if that's confusing or frustrating for you, I need you to kind of talk through that with me, ask a question so we can make sure you're clear on that. But it is important for us to know that all of these different categories have some room for overlapping. One piece of evidence could fall into multiple categories at the same time. And just because you are fitting into one category doesn't mean that others don't also apply. And all those categories are designed for is to help us better predict and understand, okay, what kind of analysis do I need to do? What room for possible error do I have for this evidence? And what other steps do I need to take to try to prevent those errors in the process of doing that analysis?